And I'm starting, and then you can let in.
Bilingual Yiddish-English radical lesbian poet, scholar. She was born in 1941 on the Aryan side of Warsaw, where she was passing with her mother, while her father was one of the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising who perished there. And she became first a poet in the English language and then influenced by trends of Spanish, English, bilingual writing. They were part of lesbian politics and poetics. She started writing Yiddish and English. And I remember when I was first doing research in Warsaw, looking at Yiddish women's poetry, I had this deep desire to find, and if not find, more a temptation to invent a lesbian Yiddish poet whose story I could discover and then write, lesbian history about. And then I was in a conference in Berkeley, and suddenly I sort of found out that my imaginary Yiddish lesbian poetess was flesh and blood, and that was extremely exciting.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm thrilled that you're here this evening for this wonderful event, Sinister Wisdom celebration of Irena Klepfisz. We began with an altar nigun performed by Isle of Klepfisz, and then heard from scholar Zohar Wyman-Kelman speaking about Irena Klepfisz. My name is Julie Enzer, and I'm pleased to welcome you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a chakra block hour planned for you, with plans to wrap up around 8 p.m. on the East Coast, including a bit of time for question, answer, and testimony at the end of the program, and a dance song from our Sinister Wisdom 119 launch that we'll share and dance with again at the end, as has become our practice. If you are not familiar with Sinister Wisdom is a quarterly journal of lesbian literature and art. If you're not currently a subscriber, I encourage you to sign up for a subscription today by going to sinisterwisdom.org/subscribe. Your subscription between now and March 15th will begin with Sinister Wisdom 119, to be a Jewish dyke in the 21st century. And I'm so pleased that though the wait has been long, the journal is making its way to subscribers. Last Friday down in Florida, I did the happy dance that my issue arrived. I'm holding it up here. I haven't even unwrapped it. It's so exciting to me. Sinister Wisdom 119 went in the mail on December 29th and was held up in delays with the U.S. Postal Service as a result of cuts by the previous administration and ongoing COVID challenges. In addition to receiving my own copy, I've heard from other people who have started receiving theirs in Arizona, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis. So it is getting out there. I encourage everyone to be patient. We will have a plan to request lost copies as a part of the next issue, which will go in the mail in mid to late March. Everyone will receive a copy. I'm just trying to assess whether I'll need to reprint or not. Mail House, which has been right all along, fully expects 99% of our copies to reach people by March 15th. So I hope that is the case. I thank you all for your patience, and as always, have great appreciation and respect for the many ways that you all individually lift up and support the work of Sinister Wisdom and lesbian literature and arts. Thank you so much. Before I turn the program over and we get started with this evening of goodness, I have a few housekeeping notes. First, as you all know, keep your microphone muted throughout the program so that things can proceed without distractions. We will mute you if we hear anything, and there will be an opportunity for questions and comments at the end. You can raise your hand or put a note in the chat box if you want to speak, or private message me. As the program proceeds, if you want to show appreciation for Irena and Rachel, please wave your hands. We always love this. You can use the reaction emojis on Zoom as well. Go ahead and test that out now if you'd like to. And light up the chat on Zoom. And if you're listening on Facebook, feel free to put comments there. I will try to monitor those as well. If you need technical assistance this evening, you can chat with me or Casey Moore. We're the technical gurus for the evening. We are recording this event, and I did manage to start the recording at the very beginning, which I'm proud of, and we will make it available starting tomorrow or Thursday. It will be at www.sinisterwisdom.org/SW119, and I'll put that into the chat when I'm done speaking. So as you all know, we have an amazingly special evening tonight with Irena Klepfisz. First, Irena is going to read from her work, and then she'll be in conversation with Rachel Levitzky. I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome the two of them to our Sinister Wisdom event this evening. There'll be time at the end for questions and comments from the audience. And I know you will want to spend not 1 hour, but many hours with Irena and Rachel. So I hope that they will both come back at some point in the future. But tonight we'll stick to the 1 hour plan. As painful as it is, after our dance song is over, I will end the Zoom. To introduce Irena and then to introduce Rachel a little bit later, I am now pleased to turn the program over to our newest Sinister Wisdom board member and former intern and guest editor of a forthcoming issue of the journal, Shramona Mandel. Shramona.
Hi everyone, I'm Shramona Mandel. I'm the newest addition to the Sinister Wisdom board, and I have the incredible honor tonight of introducing the poet and elder who we have all virtually gathered for, Dr. Irena Klepfisz. I met Dr. Klepfisz just last year through an oral history interview for Sinister Wisdom, and I was introduced to her work while exploring Conditions magazine, which she co-founded in 1977. I know Dr. Klepfisz is one of the germinal Yiddishists who broke the silence surrounding Yiddish women writers and co-edited The Tribe of Dinah, a Jewish women's anthology. I also know her as a deeply admired bilingual lesbian poet with a lifelong commitment to internationalist and feminist organizing. There is so much about her life and work that I and others in the room aspire to, and it was a privilege for me when Dr. Klepfisz shared with Julie and me one of her aspirations, to create Freuen Verlag, a women's press publishing writing in Yiddish. Thank you, Irena Klepfisz, for sharing your time, your vision, your commitment, and your precious words with us today. Turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shramona. I'm very, very honored to be here, and I'm a little bit, I think, overwhelmed, partly because I can't see any of you really, and so this is a kind of strange reading for me that I've never done before. But I'm very grateful to Julie and to Rachel and to Shramona for taking the time and energy to do this. I'm going to be reading from a new manuscript that is tentatively titled Her Birth and Later Years. And it's a manuscript that's divided into 3 sections. And I'm going to read a few poems from, or at least one poem from each of the sections. I'm going to begin with the first section, which is called Footnotes. And I'm going to read two poems from this, I'm going to read two poems from this section. And I'm going to begin by first reading the note and then reading the poem. I never knew my father, Michał. I saw him last when he was 1.5, and he was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising when I was 2. Besides 2 photographs, one when he was 8 and another when he was 18, I've had no physical material objects connected with him to verify his existence. But about 4 years ago, I discovered that Michał's student file was intact in the archives of the Warsaw Polytechnic, the engineering school he attended before the war. Amazingly, it contained a copy of his birth certificate, school transcripts, and his handwritten letters requesting financial aid. The last of these was dated March 1939, and as most of you know, Hitler invaded Poland just a few months later on September 1st. This poem is called Warsaw, March 1939, Warsaw, Poland. I understand nothing but the date, March 27th, 1939. I want to whisper, grab everyone and run to the nearest port, the nearest border. But he is worried about tuition. He understands oppression, hatred, slavery, torture, but extermination, genocide, gas ovens, Jacob, Miriam, Gina, and Rikla, all his Bundeskamerads, fellow students, athletes, and Friedrich, extermination. I press. Forget the silverware, Babcha's lace. Forget the books, the photo albums, the anniversary brooch. Forget the diplomas, Jakob's, Miriam's, Gina's, yours, Mayas's drawings. Just tell Rushka to hurry and get her mother. No time for goodbyes to Guta, Krisha, Mayus, but take the papers, money in the desk. Forget the protractor, rulers, pencils, notebooks, take the knapsacks, pack scissors, clothes for layers, hats, scarves, a compass. Remember needles and thread, and also string, an extra pair of shoes. Talk calmly, but hurry the old ones. Go, run, don't look back, just go, go. Michał, don't try to be a hero, be my father. It's March 1939. In just 5 months, the butcher will begin grinding meat. The note for this is Razan El Najjar, a 21-year-old nurse, was killed on June 1st, 2018, during one of the numerous confrontations at the Gaza border between Palestinian protesters and Israeli soldiers. And the poem is called In Memory of Razan El Najjar. 1. To be honest, I really am not sure how to pronounce her name, but I know who she was and know she was 21. There are international disagreements. Was it intentional? Was it an accident? Was she helping the wounded, or was she resisting, meaning deliberately throwing what at those rifles and tanks? Do we feel glad? Do we feel guilty and outraged? Do we feel safer? Do we feel defensive, meaning protective of ourselves? We are in danger. After all, we are at war. Is she a martyr? Is this exactly what Hamas had hoped for? Or is this, please remember the antecedent, a dead 21-year-old nurse, simply a PR nightmare for Jews in and out of Israel that must be addressed in international media? 2, if we save one life, we save the world. If we destroy one life, Do we destroy the world? Is the world destroyed because Razan al-Najjar was shot accidentally? Or is the world better off with this 21-year-old dead? If we are destroyed with it, the world, with her, Razan al-Najjar. 3. I marvel, isn't it incredible that we are arguing over the death of a 21-year-old nurse, Razan al-Najjar, by a bullet aimed, ricocheted, or bounced off of from this one, a sniper, or from another, also a 21-year-old, inexperienced and frightened, or that one, a fighter for his people and nation, or that one who didn't know how to get out of the service, or this one who wanted proof that she too was brave. Isn't it incredible? Just a second. My papers are flying. Now you know this wasn't pre-recorded and I'm live. Sorry about that. The second section is called Mourning Cycle, and it's dedicated to the painter Judith Waterman, my lover and partner of almost 40 years, who died 6 years ago. Almost 10 years before I met her, Judy had bought a house in upstate, about 4-hour drive from Brooklyn. Judy loved and identified with this house, which contains a studio where she could live and paint, and in a small apartment which she rented out. And we ended up spending an enormous amount of time up there. But during the last 4 years of her life, Judy was too ill to go up there. It was just too far. So we essentially abandoned the house. I went up there again for the first time a month after she died. This is a poem about that first visit. In it, I refer to privets, which is a very common shrub that many people plant instead of using fencing. Most of you have seen it probably a million times, you just don't know the name. So this poem is called This House. After 4 years, I returned to this peace, this empty space with its paint-spattered floor, grateful that you let me in when you were so afraid another presence would overwhelm it. There are so many ghosts, you would be sad. Dave's mini market is gone. So is the country store, also the grocery in the next town, though the bagel place keeps on across the road from the Sunday flea market. I drove on the back road. It's paved now. Almost didn't recognize that hunting lodge, 4 walls with a roof, and now a live-in house. That bicycle dangling from the tree above that silly pond, gone. The pig farmer's barn is locked. Remember those noisy little piglets, how he held them by their legs so we could see them up close? No trace of them, so freshly pink, running nowhere down the dirt path. And the woman with the goats, she's gone too, as is the flaming lavender trailer where the 2 women lived, and we never did get beyond our own suspicions, for who could we have asked? You knew the name of every insignificant road at every turn, and I'm trying to remember your roads and stop now at the place where you wanted me to cut some purple flowers still blooming on a bank. Today, I placed a few in that small green vase. The truth, the house needs mending, so long neglected. It needs your care. I'm trying to channel you, repairing clapboards, the broken well cover, the broken steps. You may be gone, but are always with me. We're 2 ghosts joined. And when I clear the roses, when I cut the strangling vines, I can hear you whisper, go help the privets. Let the privets breathe. The rest of the poems that I'm going to read are from the last section of the manuscript. And it's a section that it's very mixed. It's about a lot of, I guess it's about writing poetry, about writing, creativity, old age and death, all sort of mixed up. And this is a poem that I wrote that's dedicated to Jean Swallow. Jean Swallow was a lesbian writer who I met because she and Jeff Manasseh, a gay photographer, were doing a book on gay families. And they came they had done the project for a long time, and they came to Judy and me and my mother and photographed us and interviewed us. And 2 months after that, Jean Swallow committed suicide. And that was in January of 1995. And this is a poem to her that I wrote at the time for Jean Swallow, whom I barely knew. Did you think the world, all of us, would die with you? Here's what you've missed, and it's only been 2 days. The earthquake in Japan, the recovery in California, short-lived, the official declaration of war on affirmative action, my last letter to you with suggestions and questions. Now, everyone feels guilty. If only I hadn't yelled, if only I had written sooner, if only I'd been more welcoming, if only I'd given in, as if each of us were responsible and you, a mere onlooker, a manipulated victim of your own suicide. It's hard to imagine anything less passive. The repeated gestures, 300 aspirins, swallowing handfuls, washing each down and then swallowing another again and again. And yet your last letter just a few days before was full of hope and the future, a novel taking shape. Each night poetry simmering for the time being somewhere beneath the surface. Shortly before that, you were visiting New York and you talked of a prose poem rejected by some who had said, this is not how a poem should look. Where should the lines end, you had asked? And then the eternal, what is poetry after all? I replied, only what I know. Our poems are like our lives, sometimes carefully crafted, but mostly haphazard, shaped, unleashed by unleashed instinctual needs we barely recognize, much less understand. A poem is totally your own, I advised. Stick by it. Ignore what others say. I remember that day's conversation. We were walking aimlessly, oblivious of city streets, only vaguely concentrating on looking for your car, which you had forgotten was parked where? I've taught poetry to others. Some barely listen. Perhaps you listened too hard and shaped your poems like a series of bottles fitted to the palm of your hand. But at the time, the talk seemed to bring a breath of relief. Yes, you said, I must remember that. You needed to die. Now I must remember, in the matter of suicide, nothing the rest of us do matters much. The postponed letter, the unsaid wise advice. You needed to die. Didn't worry what would happen 2 days later. Indifferent to the difference between wraparound prose and the cutoff line. And the rest of us, lover, collaborator, old friend, or recent acquaintance, we live on. Your suicide, neither guilty excuse nor hard lesson for the lives we lead or decide to take. These other poems don't really need any kind of introduction. This is called Grief, Brunswick Public Library, Maine. At the library, the woman with the broken English is broken, and so she wails, cracking the comforting silence. Everyone stops at the computers, along the orderly shelves, at the children's desk where the paper mache animals seem to be drained of their colors as if the sound has washed them in tears. She clutches a small girl and weeps, her arms tight around the child while a librarian tries to calm her. It's an old story. Her husband left, simply left, for the West Coast, for Singapore, Canada, for a job just down the highway in Harpswell. Perhaps she has no home to go to. Perhaps she'll kill herself and the child. She wails. I think about the child, her fear, the father gone, and soon the mother too. For who will risk her with this woman? Who will risk the mother's pounding heart, her terror, her realization that she is alone on this unfathomable continent in a library with so many atlases and answers, and not one to translate an abandoned woman awash in grief. Der Fremder in der Fremd. Gedenkst, do you remember when you were a stranger among strangers, a Fremder on Papieren, a stranger without papers? Gedenkst die Frages, those endless questions, wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Wer seine gewen eure Schreinem? Who were your neighbors? Where was the school? What work did you do? What can you do here that you couldn't do there? Noch einmal, for the third, fourth, fifth time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Wer ist der Mann? Wer ist die Frau? Who is this man? Who is this woman? Und die Papieren and their papers, und das Kind and this child, did you find it here or bring it from there? Do you have a passport for him, for her? Für ein Kind, that one with the dark hair? Noch einmal, for the 10th, 11th, 12th time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Who do you know here? Who did you know there? Where will you sleep here? How did you sleep there? Und eure Chaloimes, what did you dream of here? What did you dream of there? Where will you work here? And work did you do there? And why can't you just work there? Wo is the visa, the green carte, the passport, visa, green card, passport, photo from here and from there? And why did you cut your hair? Und das Kind? And why did you bring this child here and not leave it there? Noch einmal for the 18th, 19th, 20th time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Für was seid ihr da und nicht geblieben dorten? Why are you here? And why didn't you just stay there? And I'm going to end with this, which is a combination, sort of. This is called The Old Poet Remembers the Immigrant Girl. From the start, the chorus always said, we don't want what you have to give. We don't care who you are. You have to become different, change. When she first walked into class and pledged with the wrong hand, they all chorused. She stood mute, ashamed, as a teacher corrected her, still mute when they chorused the incomprehensible sounds. After a time, she understood that girls would talk behind her back about her ugly stockings, the bows in her hair, the braids too tightly braided. It was all noise and dust and cars and loneliness, a mother at work, a glass of milk, a sandwich waiting on the kitchen table. Everyone whispered. She was no one's friend. They locked her in a closet until her mother came home and claimed her. She learned she would be outside, that people would stop speaking to her and not tell her that there was always a struggle to be in, which meant that someone always had to be out. She was dressed in humiliation, the homemade skirts by the mother who had no husband. Once in class, the teacher asked them to tell what their father did, and at her turn, she stood mute again because she could not bring herself to say, "He's dead. My father is dead. He has always been dead." The words were only sounds, for her memory was blank, but they were sounds she could not risk. So she stood mute again until the teacher asked, "Do you have a father?" And she shook her head in shame, in fear, and sat down. She learned nothing they wanted her to know, but everything else about being alone, about keeping it close to her heart, about silence, about how her own words rebounded in her silence, about how she could use them, but only if she remained on the outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irena. In this next part, Dr. Klepfisz will be joined in conversation with Rachel Levitzky. Dr. Levitzky follows in the legacies of bilingual women writers and poets, working on multilingual poetry and poetry in hybrid forms. Her published, translated, and performed work spans her book-length poem, Under the Sun, 5 chapbooks of poetry, Dearly, Dearly 356, Cartographies of Error, The Adventures of Yaya and Grace, and 2 one-by-one portraits, as well as full-length volume called Neighbor, several online and print magazines, and even poetry plays. Rachel Levitzky is also a committed cultivator of feminist literary learning, politics, and spaces. She co-founded and co-directs Belladonna Collective, which evolved from a Blue Stockings reading group in 1999 into the events and publishing series, which, like me, turns 22 this year. Without further ado, let us now turn it over to Irena and Rachel.
It's a huge honor to be here. And Irena, thank you for that remarkable reading. I loved every second of it. Thank you so much. So of course I have a million questions, and of course I've changed all my questions now that I've heard you read. But actually, is my sound fine? Just want to check, do a sound check. Okay. So I think I am going to start with the question about telling stories in poetry. As I was reading over your work and your new manuscript and older work, I was just struck by the sense I had of this intense observation, deep observation, and like a profoundly painful stories that maybe because of their clarity and their unsentimentality didn't leave me wrecked. I mean, they left me fully engaged, but not wrecked. And I, once again, listening to you just now, I had that same feeling of just awe that this was possible to go so deeply into the eye of the storm of these painful stories and still leave whole. So I guess my question is, so you write these stories of close-up, deep observation of profound pain, but you also write prose essays that are clear in their intent and expression. I wonder if you can talk a little about what is possible, what is especially possible in telling stories in the form of poetry rather than prose or fiction.
That is the question. What is poetry after all? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the stories I think in poems are not really like stories in fiction. I mean, I don't think the stories in in poems are like have a beginning, middle, and an end, and a character development, for example. They're more like maybe a bits of plot, you know, that you tune into. Like, for example, in the story about what happened at the library, you know, we were on vacation. It was Judy and I were on vacation in Maine. We always go to libraries. I mean, can't resist. So we walked into this beautiful library in Brunswick, and there was this sudden trauma happened with this immigrant woman. You know, that story doesn't have a beginning. There's a story there, but we don't have a beginning, middle, and end. And if I were to write, in fact, a story about that episode, it would be quite different, I think. I think in poetry, you pull out I think poetry is much more about moments. And there may be a few moments, but they're not real complete plots. I always think that poetry, I mean, one of the things I like to think about in poetry is that poetry kind of stops time. And you sort of stop what's happening and you have a moment. And what you do is you stretch out that moment so you can see it in all its multiplicity. And a poem, I think, can I mean, you know, when things happen, like even in that episode in the library, there were so many feelings going on at the same time. You know, I mean, protection of her, fear of the mother, protection of the mother, just horrified at the whole mess, you know. But I think that's much harder to do in prose. And I think in poetry, you're able to sort of stop that moment and push in a lot of maybe jarring feelings that you don't generally think of as together, you know, as combining. So they are kind of, you know, bits and pieces. One of the things that I early on really liked, one of the poets that I learned, and maybe it was really, I'm not sure, but I think it was like the first English language poet that I responded to in any way, was Robert Browning. I loved his dramatic monologues. I mean, when the first time I read My Last Duchess, I became a literature person, you know. I mean, it was just so intriguing to me. Now that's a good example. There's some kind of story, but you don't really know what the story is, you know. So I've always sort of, I think this particular reading is a little bit skewed because those kinds of poems are easier to read at a reading than more different other kinds of poems that I also write that are non-stories. But I do think that it's more about moments rather than a real narrative in the sense that we generally think about in fiction.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about poetry stopping time, and it's a good segue to a next question, which is sort of has two parts to it. You've had a consistent interest in moving between in figuring out like what does it mean to be a Jewish radical dyke lesbian, and also be an activist and have an ethical and broad perspective while also really honoring Jewishness. And speaking of having that interest over time, I wonder if you could talk about how that's changed over time.
What's changed? Just what I'm
being a Jewish activist lesbian, radical lesbian, and being concerned about it in your work.
You know, I think my work reflects my life. I mean, I think I was talking to some people yesterday and I said my early writing was strictly about the Holocaust. And I really had a fear that I would never write about anything but the Holocaust. I just thought that would be my only topic. And that ended when I came out and I suddenly discovered, or as I like to put it, when I decided I had a life, I decided to have a life. And so my poetry changed. I mean, suddenly I had other subjects to write about. You know, and I think your poetry goes where your life goes, you know. And I think it was, I don't know whether Susan Sherman is here tonight or not, but I think she once said something like that. I always remembered. She said, if you want to change your poetry, you better change your life, because I mean, they're just really intimately connected. And when I became active, which was not something I had ever planned or wanted to do, I mean, that came into my work. I mean, it was sort of hard not to include it. I really wouldn't know how to do that. And so like even in this particular manuscript, I mean, a third of the manuscript is the mourning cycle about Judy's death. And sort of what it's been like since she died. That's my life. I mean, I can't kind of not write about it. So everything else, I mean, I always think that there's something you can write about, that there's almost nothing that you can't write about. Let me put it that way. I don't know if that answers it. I don't know if it
Totally. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a beautiful answer. And I mean, the other thing I was thinking about was that the first two poems, I was so struck that of how they sort of span the ethical concerns of your life, right? In some ways, or of a Jew in the 20th and 21st century, right? Your father, finding your father's March 1939 application for financial aid and what was to happen, and then Razan al-Najjar was that 2019 or 2020, 80 years later, and sort of just I was just struck. I mean, this is, I guess, not a question so much, but struck by the expanse of those ethical concerns. And in the Jean Swallow poem, you talk about like everyone constructing the suicide as some accident of her passivity, and there's like an ethical drive to toward agency in all of these poems, right? And even your father applying to financial aid during, I mean, yeah, during Hitler hadn't invaded Poland yet, but Hitler's existed, times were bad. And so my next question is, during all these extreme incidences that you're witnessing and that you're deeply observing, how do we go, how do we go about quotidian life in these extreme conditions?
There's a wonderful, it's a great question. And there's a wonderful, wonderful, unbeatable answer to that. And that's by Grace Paley, called A Midrash on Happiness. I don't know, I mean, everybody that's listening, look it up. You can get the whole thing on the internet. It's a midrash. And it's really about that question, because one of the things, I mean, it's very humorous. It's just incredible, but it just nails that issue about, and when I've taught it, very often students misread it because they think she's trying to guilt trip the speaker, but the speaker is really aiming for happiness in a world that is really terrible. And that we have to be able to do that, and that we almost can't not do it, because we fall in love, we have our pleasures, we have the things that we really that we value. There's always that, and that has to go on. If it doesn't go on, and I think art always, in times of terrible times, becomes, I mean, we know that enslaved people create art. We know people that in concentration camps created art. I mean, there's a reason that people do that. And under the worst circumstances, read it. I really recommend A Midrash on Happiness. Grace Paley just says it in that. It's and we just do. I mean, it's the way we keep going. And we have to know that we may create a temporary bubble, a momentary bubble in which we experience that, but it also revives us. That you can't function if you're just totally worn down by or overwhelmed by everything that's around you. I don't know if that answers it, but
yeah, it's beautiful. It also, it's open, your answer is so open that obviously there's not one thing to do. There's, and
there isn't one.
work.
I think it's whatever you want to, whatever you want to do, but I think you have to do it. I think it's very difficult. I mean, and I say this as someone who sometimes just decides to check out and not do anything. So it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I was just outraged at the news about, 20 minutes before this started. I was almost throwing stuff at the TV because I was so aggravated.
Yeah,
But,
sometimes it really gets.
so, I mean, but we have to do it. And I think we have models for that. I mean, that in the past, I mean, we can look at people in incredible circumstances who somehow still keep moving on. It's not, you know, we have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, however we figure it out, right? I want to ask you a question. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading back, I think it was, yeah, in Adrienne Rich's A Few Words in the Mother Tongue, and there was one moment where she talked about North Americans instead of saying Americans, as you know, United Statesians are called Americans. And I know that now people say US Americans. And I was just sort of thinking about ways that, you know, like now we call all the small aggressions of dominance microaggressions. There's like language that emerges over time to talk about the things that we've been talking about for a while, and it shifts and changes. And I was thinking about the impact of those shifts over generations in time. And even like now we live in a time where things happen really quickly, where language can emerge really quickly. And I was thinking about that and in relationship to you as a person working in 3 languages and two languages, right. But you've done translation both from Yiddish and Polish. Am I wrong about that?
Not Polish. No, my Polish isn't good enough. No.
Okay. Pardon me. Yeah, so I was wondering if working, like having 2 languages in some ways, I guess, protects you from the volatility of language in each, or no, or if you could just talk about.
No, I think just, you know, terms change, but, you know, sometimes I think, you know, it's like the second wave thought that it was the first wave. You know, I mean, we reinvent something that's already happened, and then we give it new language, but in fact it's already happened and just used a different language. So I think there's a tendency for that to happen. And for all kinds of, I suppose, psychological reasons, people want to own their own thing. They don't want to just inherit stuff. They want to create, you know, there's all kinds of reasons why that happens. But I think part of it is because we do kind of reinvent the wheel all the time. And every time we reinvent it, we change some of the language. I mean, some of it I think is an expansion and a widening of perceptions and sensitivities. And I think that that's good. Some of it is just, to me, some of it is just recycling something with a new language. So something that's existed before. So I think both things are going on at the same time. I don't think I mean, you know, my Yiddish and my poetry, I always feel a little guilty about this because I think people think I do it more than I actually do it. And the reason is that it's really, really hard to do in a poem. I use Yiddish a lot more in my prose, in my essays, and some of the fiction I've written you know, and it's just very hard to do in poetry because poetry, you want to be integrated when you're working in it. Working in any language, writing a poem, you want to be integrated. You want to be organic. You want to, and for me, because I'm not truly bilingual in Yiddish, that doesn't happen with Yiddish. I have to stop and think. That's not what you want to do when you're working on something. So trying to blend the Yiddish into the English is really hard in a poem. It's much easier to do in prose, where you're not worried about that organic kind of sense. So, I mean, like what I read today, the Fremder and the Fremd was almost a natural poem because I like the Yiddish, because in the Yiddish, there's that root Fremd, which means strange. So it's both a noun and a place. So the Fremder and the Fremd, which you can't really translate very well in English. I do it in the poem, not accurately. I say a stranger among strangers, but it's really a stranger in a foreign land.
Yeah.
Or away from home or something like that. So I don't use it. I don't do it as much as people, I think, would like me to do it.
Well, you know, I feel like I'll end with this question. We've all learned so much from you tonight and over the years. This has a merged question between Julie and I. Now that Julie says, and you're turning 80 in a few months, and what are the things that you feel, 2 months, when exactly?
April 17th.
Oh, you're an Aries.
Yes.
Fire. That makes sense. So what are you looking forward to in your work, or what's important to you? What would you like us to do for your 80th birthday in the world?
Boy, this is a trap. I wasn't
No,
expecting.
no. I mean, what I was wondering is, like, I feel like we can learn so much from. I mean, just when you were talking when you were reading your Jean Swallow poem, I was like, oh, I've just learned about poetry also in the poem.
Well,
It's really an open question. What are you looking forward to?
well, I'm looking forward to my second shot. This is very honest, which is on March 13th.
Amazing.
And I'm looking forward to that enabling me a little bit more to get out. I mean, it's been difficult, and but I don't think it's been more difficult or less difficult than other people. So I don't have, I mean, I have some plans, as probably, I don't know, probably other people. I'm completing, there's going to be a bilingual edition of my poetry published in Poland.
Amazing.
So I'm working on that, and that's probably going to come out in about a year. We're working on it, and it's going to have some excerpts, short excerpts, I think, from my essays. So that's been a big project, and that's taking up a lot of space. There's a publisher, the contract, it's supposed to happen. Though I have to say, with COVID, it's always very, you don't feel that secure about stuff. So I'm definitely working on that, and I'm hoping to get this manuscript out also. So that's sort of, things are still moving a little bit, even though I'm 80.
Doing great.
I can't believe it.
I should only hope. Well, I hope we get to celebrate your birthday in some proper fashion.
Yes,
And I think the plan is for me to pass this to Julie now.
Yes. So I do not yet see questions from the audience, but I think, Irena, you had another poem that you were going to read near the end. Is that correct? You'll treat us with another poem?
I've treated a poem that I know people really like and they like to hear. So this is my first bilingual poem, which is a contrast to the one I read before. And it's called Etliche Wörter auf Mamaloshen, a few words in the mother tongue. Lemushel, for example, die Kurve, the whore, a woman who acknowledges her passions. Die Yidene, the Jewish woman, ignorant, overbearing. Let's face it, every woman is one. Die Yenta, the gossip, the busybody who knows what's what and is never caught off guard. Die Lesbianka, the one with the roommate, though we never use the word. Das Weibel, the wife or the little woman. In der Heim, at home, where she does everything to keep Yiddishkeit alive. Yiddishkeit, a way of being Jewish, always arguable. In Mark, where she buys die Kartoffel and challah, yes, potatoes and challah, die Kartoffel, the material counterpart of Yiddishkeit. Mit Sibyles, with onions that bring Tränen zu die Augen, tears to her eyes when she sees how little it all is. Weniger and weniger, less and less. Die Halle, braided via Haar Vater Hasana, like her hair before the wedding when she was Azashain Mädel, such a pretty girl. Die lange schwarze Haar, the long black hair, die lange schwarze Haar. A Frau Holland, a woman dreams, ihr Ort auf der Welt, her place in this world. Und sie hat Meure, and she is afraid, so afraid of the words Kurve, Yidene, Yente, Lesbianka, Weibel. Sie Holland, she dreams, und sie hat Meure, and she is afraid. Ihr Ort, die Welt, die Heim, der Mark. A Mädel cholemt, a Kurve cholemt, a Yidene cholemt, a Jente Holland, a Lesbianke Holland, a Weibel Holland, die Kartoffel, die Halle, Jüdischkeit, sie Holland, die Hor, die lange schwarze Hor, sie Holland, sie Holland, sie Holland. Thank you.
I said, oh, that's so lovely when I was muted. So wonderful. I do have a question from someone in the audience, Irena, and the question is, I think people want to hear you reflect on this kind of moment of right-wing extremism in the United States, stoking anti-Semitism again, and your thoughts about kind of what's happening in this current moment. What do you see happening? How do you respond? And I think people particularly wondering that given that there's not a sort of really vibrant working class Jewish community that sort of feels absent to as a part of the response to what's going on with the right wing right now. So I wondered if you just have some closing thoughts about our political moment.
Well, I don't have anything that I think is any smarter than anybody else. I mean, I think it's very disturbing what we're living through. Certainly, I find it kind of, I mean, I think it's always, in some ways, it's not surprising because it certainly, at least was most evident at the beginning of Obama's administration, the last, 16 years or so. I don't have anything, it's horrific. And I think we have to be very vigilant. And I think we have to be extremely careful. I was very upset actually today because they had hearings about the January 6th insurrection in the House and the Senate. And when I haven't, because I was preparing for today, I haven't watched the news, and I turned on the news at like about 4 o'clock, and it was a wipeout. It was all about Tiger Woods' car crash. And that went on for hours. There was nothing to report. He was in the hospital. He was having surgery. I think it's important to know. But it just, to me, this is very frightening that this kind of investigative probing that was going on in Washington is just wiped out completely. And about white supremacists, about all of it, racism, anti-Semitism. And it's, we have to watch about Tiger Woods' car accident for 3 hours. And you couldn't get news. I mean, you just couldn't get news. And that is, to me, equally frightening, that there's no commitment, doesn't seem to be a commitment in the media. And I think it leaves us responsible for trying to keep it in people's heads. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a difficult moment, Julie. And I think we're seeing things that were very much sort of there, but never quite as open as it is now. And that's very, very, very frightening. And I find it ironic that, I came to this country when I was 8, escaping after World War II. And it feels like it's just shocking. It's shocking.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, for sharing some of your new work, which, as you know, I love and am deeply excited and passionate about. I want to thank everyone for coming and joining us this evening. A few final announcements, and then we'll have a little dance. The video from this evening will be made available on the Sinister Wisdom website tomorrow or Thursday at sinisterwisdom.org/SW119. We have a writing workshop coming up this Saturday, launching our series of 5 writing workshops for the spring. Casey's putting information in the chat about that. There's a couple spaces available for this Saturday and in the subsequent ones. Next Tuesday, we're having our second hot talk on the topic lesbian or queer. It features Sinister Wisdom board member Cheryl Clark in conversation with Shakira Refos. It will also be a lively evening. In March, Minnie Bruce Pratt will join us to read from her new book, Magnified. All of the information about the Sinister Wisdom events are available at sinisterwisdom.org/events. For our final song, we have music that we used in the 119 launch from Alicia Sviegels, designed to get everyone up and dancing. Alicia Sviegels is the world's leading klezmer fiddler and founder of the Grammy-winning Klezmatics, which she co-led for 17 years. As you listen to the music, stand up, dance. We will highlight your video. When the music ends, I will end the Zoom call. I thank you all for joining us. Please give me a moment while I try and make everything work properly for the big share of our song. And it seems to have disappeared at the moment. There we are. Share song. Oops.
There, yeah.
Here. Thank you all very much. We will see you at our next event.